All right, let's take a look at section 3. Here's the focus question. Although millions died in combat during World War I, 20 to 40 million people were killed during the 1918 to 1919 flu pandemic, including 675,000 Americans. The disease was spread rapidly via wartime mobilization and hit young adults especially hard. Some places, such as San Francisco, closed schools, churches, and public amusements and passed a mandatory mask ordinance to prevent further spread. This led to the creation of an anti mask league that, like the opposition to mask mandates during the COVID 19 pandemic, criticized the efficacy of mask wearing as a violation of personal liberty. By the spring of 1919, falling case numbers, wartime demobilization, labor upheaval, and the Red Scare caused the pandemic to be largely forgotten. Commenting on American intervention in the war, Randolph Bourne wrote, "War is the health of the state." Bourne saw the expansion of government power in war as a threat, but most progressives saw it as an opportunity for reforming America and spreading progressive values across the world. Virtually all progressives rallied behind Wilson in the war, including intellectuals like John Dewey, journalists Walter Lippmann and Herbert Crawley, and Samuel Gompers, president of the American Federation of Labor, to name a few. Dewey told progressives to recognize the social possibilities of the war. The war created a national government with unprecedented power and an increased presence in Americans' lives. With the Selective Service Act of May 1918, 24 million men had to register for the draft, and the Army grew from 120,000 to 5 million. New federal agencies were created to regulate industry, transportation, labor relations, and agriculture. A War Industries Board oversaw all aspects of war production, from distributing raw materials to setting prices for manufactured goods, and it created standardized specifications for nearly everything. The Railroad Administration controlled the nation's transportation, the Fuel Agency rationed coal and oil, and the Food Administration, directed by Herbert Hoover, helped farmers increase crop yields and promoted more efficient food preparation. These agencies generally saw themselves as friends to business as much as regulators of it, and they guaranteed government contractors a high rate of profit and encouraged cooperation among businesses by suspending antitrust laws. The War Labor Board, however, included representatives of government, industry, and the AFL, and instituted in some industries a minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, and protections for unions. Wages rose significantly in the war, working conditions improved in many places, and union membership doubled. Corporate and income taxes soared. By 1918, the wealthiest Americans were paying 60% of their income in taxes, and millions of Americans purchased Liberty bonds. With peace, this wartime state rapidly dissolved, but it momentarily gave progressives hope that government could rationalize the economy and society for the sake of justice and national purpose. Many Americans doubted whether America should intervene in the struggle between rival empires. Many outright opposed American entry into the war, as did groups such as the Industrial Workers of the World and much of the Socialist Party. In April 1917, to counteract anti-war sentiment, Wilson created the Committee of Public Information, directed by George Creel, to run a campaign to build support for the war. The CPI enlisted academics, journalists, artists, and advertisers to flood the nation with pro-war propaganda, from posters to movies. The agency trained and sent across the nation 75,000 Minutemen to deliver brief and standardized talks, sometimes in immigrant languages, to audiences at schools and movie theaters. The federal government had never before had an agency dedicated to manipulating public opinion, and future administrations mounted similar campaigns during World War II, the Cold War, and conflicts in Iraq. The administration and the CPI made its appeal in a progressive language of social cooperation and expanded democracy. This meant a peace based on national self-determination abroad and industrial democracy at home. The CPI tried to sell the war to workers as a fight for democracy by promising the 8-hour workday after the war. Freedom was also a key term in the mobilization, and the CPI argued that the war was being fought for the great cause of freedom. The Statue of Liberty was a common image in wartime propaganda and was used in particular to rally immigrants. Buying Liberty bonds became a way to demonstrate patriotism. The German Kaiser and the German nation and people were defined as the antithesis of freedom and depicted as barbaric Huns. The use of the words democracy and freedom as ideological weapons of war inevitably sparked demands for their expansion at home. In 1916, Wilson seemed to endorse women's suffrage, but the war threatened to splinter the movement, as many in it opposed American intervention. Even the first woman in Congress, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted against American entry into the war. But most suffrage movement leaders and most women supported and participated in war mobilization, selling bonds, organizing patriotic rallies, and working in war production. A new and more militant generation of women activists, organized in the National Women's Party, pushed for suffrage with tactics that scandalized older women activists, such as civil disobedience and demonstrations in front of the White House. Led by Alice Paul, these tactics, coupled with wartime service, pressured the White House to fully endorse women's suffrage. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment, barring any state from using sex as a qualification for suffrage, was ratified. The U.S. became the 27th country to allow women to vote. The war also enhanced other women reformers' campaigns, especially prohibition. Several factors helped finally to secure the prohibition of the sale of liquor nationwide, including employers' interests in a more disciplined labor force, urban reformers who wanted orderly cities and to dismantle political machines that used saloons, and women reformers who wanted to protect wives and children from domestic abuse and the squandering of men's wages for alcohol. Many native born Protestants sought prohibitions as a means to Americanize immigrants. Prohibitionists first focused on state campaigns, which were successful in more than a dozen states, but the war made beer, often brewed by German Americans, unpopular. In December 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment prohibiting the manufacture and sale of liquors, which took effect in 1920. The war showed that during a conflict, civil liberties were often imperiled. Randolph Bourne in 1917 warned progressives that they would not be able to manipulate the war for their own liberal purposes, and that instead the war would empower the least democratic forces in American life. Despite the Wilson administration's idealistic rhetoric, the war initiated the most extreme repression of civil liberties in American history. In the eyes of Wilson and his supporters, American goals were so virtuous that disagreement reflected treason. For the first time since the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, the federal government enacted laws to restrict freedom of speech. The Espionage Act of 1917 prohibited not only spying and interfering with the draft, but also false statements that might impede military success. In 1918, the Sedition Act made it a crime to make spoken or printed statements that intended to cast scorn, contempt, or disrepute on the form of government, or that advocated interference with the war effort. The most prominent victim was Eugene V. Debs, convicted in 1918 under the Espionage Act for delivering an anti-war speech to 10. He was convicted and sent to 10 years in prison. Debs ran for president while still in prison in 1920 and received 900,000 votes. It was left to Wilson's successor, Warren G. Harding, to release Debs from prison in 1921. More extreme repression was implemented by state government and private groups. Many states imprisoned those critical of the American flag, outlawed the possession of red and black flags, symbolizing communism and anarchism, and 23 states passed criminal syndicalism laws, making it illegal to advocate political change through unlawful acts or a change in industrial ownership. Patriotism came to be synonymous with support for the government, the war, and the American economic system, while anti war sentiment, labor radicalism, and sympathy for the Russian Revolution became un American. Local authorities investigated residents who did not buy Liberty loans. Schools revised their curriculum to ensure its patriotism and required teachers to sign loyalty oaths. The 250,000 members of the American Protective League helped the Justice Department identify radicals and critics of the war by spying on neighbors and carrying out slacker raids, stopping thousands of men in major cities and requiring them to produce draft cards. Private groups used the war as an opportunity to attack their enemies, as was the case with the industrial workers of the world, whose members were attacked and some killed, and whose leadership was arrested. Even though some progressives protested individual incidents, most progressives did not challenge the general atmosphere of repression. So, that was Section 3. We'll be back for Section 4.